And welcome to this special edition of Talking Europe on France 24, where we look at the results of the UK general election. Now, incumbent Prime Minister David Cameron has defied expectation by winning a decisive victory in Britain, his Conservative Party securing an outright majority in the UK Parliament. What was billed as a neck-and-neck race turned out to be anything but that. Both Labour and the Liberal Democrats suffered major losses. As for anti-EU, anti-immigration party UKIP, well, they did get 13% of the popular vote, but that wasn't enough to give leader Nigel Farage a seat. Meanwhile, as you know, the separatist SNP won a landslide in Scotland, taking all but 3 seats in what was once a Labour stronghold. Pervenche Beres, welcome to Talking Europe. You're a French MEP. You're the chair of France's socialist delegation in the European Parliament. Also with us, Sophie Pedder. You're the Paris-based correspondent of the British weekly The Economist. Now, The Economist actually endorsed David Cameron, but as part of a coalition with the Lib Dems. These results really surprised many observers. Everybody thought that Mr. Cameron wouldn't get an outright majority. How would you explain his very strong performance?
I think that we all, a dose of humility is in order here, because nobody foresaw this. The polls didn't foresee it, the pundits didn't foresee it, the media didn't foresee it, the parties themselves didn't foresee this. So the result is really a surprise, and there's a lot of head-scratching going on in the UK right now, especially among polling groups, to find out, why was the vote for Cameron so underestimated? And there are various explanations. I mean, the usual one with the UK polling is that, the British electoral system, which is a first-past-the-post system, is quite difficult to predict because it can really hang on a matter of very, very few votes in one constituency, and that can swing the number of seats very, very fast, but doesn't necessarily correspond to the share of the vote. So that's always difficult, but that's not new. British polling groups over the years have had to get used to that. Possibly what's new is that there may be a reticence by people to say that they're going to vote Conservative, that's something that's perhaps become less socially acceptable, which sounds surprising, but there may be something in that. In any case, there's a real sense of trying to work out how to correct the software and make the models work next time to avoid this kind of embarrassing outcome.
Pervenche Beres, as I said, you chair the French socialist delegation in the European Parliament. You were, of course, supporting, I imagine, Ed Miliband. What a bad showing for the Labour, probably the worst in decades. What happened? What went wrong with the Labour Party this time?
I think you have to ask to the voters, because, in the country of the bookmakers, it's really surprising how much the results are not the one that were expected. Also, because regarding the result of the Labour, they were supposedly possibly going to be very close to the one from the Conservative, and nobody in the end knew really who would be the winner. Of course, as a French socialist, I cannot be happy when of my sister party comes out with this result. And I think, of course, we will have also our Congress in the French Socialist Party and then in the European Parliament
to examine what happened. Some say that the problem with Ed Miliband is his positioning very much on the left, and that was, of course, a departure from what we saw under Tony Blair. Do you believe that his left-wing rhetoric, although we're still far from it, put off voters in Britain?
It's difficult to say because, there was a very different analysis was done before the election, which is to say that actually matched the mood of Britain. Britain post-crisis is a very different sort of country, and there's a lot of much more discussion about inequalities, much more concern about, big gaps between rich and poor, and in a way his sort of discourse, which was to the left of Tony Blair, but it sort of matched that mood. So it's quite difficult to say in retrospect what it was that was done. I suspect that the bigger explanation really is that, the British economy is doing well. 2.8% growth expected this year. Unemployment is below 6%. There's probably a sense among those undecided voters that, perhaps best just to stick with what you've got in terms of economic policy rather than go for a big change where there is a risk involved.
But there was also expectation from the polls that it was quite a contradiction that even though these results were there in the, or appeared to be there in the British economy regarding the job rate and so on. But nevertheless, they could be tempted to vote in favor of the Labour. So this discussion was taking place before the vote. And maybe in the end, it's the voter who have decided to close this, what appeared to be a contradiction. But for me, what is really striking that even though these questions were raised during the campaign, one of the difficulty we'll have today is that in the House, Cameron is having a so big majority that how is he going to listen to some counter element and to balance another approach? I think this is going to be a tricky question.
And that's precisely what I said at the beginning of our show. The Economy said we would welcome a second term for Mr. Cameron, but as part of a coalition with the Lib Dems. Are you worried that Mr. Cameron might choose the wrong policies?
Well, The Economist, my magazine, that's precisely the argument that we made, not about economic policy, but about Europe, that Cameron's policy of holding a referendum at which, a large section of his party actually wants the UK to leave Europe is a dangerous risk, would be bad for the country, and that Brexit, the exit from the European Union by the United Kingdom, would be bad. So the argument we made that much better to have a coalition where the Liberal Democrats acted as a sort of moderating voice. They are a pro-European party. Nick Clegg was a very pro-European political leader and was able to, exercise some sort of influence to try and moderate the Euroscepticism of the Conservative Party. That's no longer the case, and there is a real worry, I think, that, a lot of people feel, even those who supported Cameron, that he has got to deal now with a very big minority of his party who doesn't want the UK to stay in Europe and is going to be campaigning not with Cameron.
And David Cameron confirmed on Friday that he will indeed hold an in-out referendum, possibly before the end of 2017. A recent poll shows that 3/4 of British people want to have a say on the current relationship between London and Brussels. After all, maybe this referendum is a good idea. Why not settle the issue once and for all?
Well, it depends how it's going to be negotiated and what's the outcome of the result. And it's a tricky task now ahead of us because you always have the double argument. You don't want to give reason for a no, so you don't want to be too strict to say it's going to be the hell for you. But on the other hand, if you don't get prepared for the outcome, then you are hand empty if the result comes up.
Now, the big question is
really
what does Mr. Cameron actually want? Because he says he wants a better deal with Europe. He wants to put the end result to the British voters. The problem, many of his partners say, is that they don't understand what David Cameron really wants. Britain is not in the euro, Britain is not in Schengen, Britain has a number of opt-outs and a very generous rebate. So what does Mr. Cameron actually want to achieve?
Well, you need to ask him, because none of us are any the wiser. This is the irony of the situation. I mean, actually, Europe is going to be the most important question in the next 2 years for the UK, and yet it was almost completely absent from the election campaign. And that's because, tactically, it wouldn't have helped David Cameron to put the question in there, because it would have boosted the vote for UKIP. So he kept quiet on Europe, and he's been extremely quiet about what he really wants to do. The only subjects he's talked about are some sort of form of restricting immigration, but, free movement of people is one of the founding pillars of the European Union, so that's completely impossible for anyone else in Europe to countenance. And the other point is restricting some sort of benefit restriction on immigrants. But it's not at all clear. And if you ask his European partners, what does he want? They're no clearer either.
You are a member of the European Parliament. You know the mood in Brussels. Angela Merkel, probably François Hollande as well, would like Britain to stay in Europe.
Definitely.
How far are they ready to reach out to Mr. Cameron?
Yeah, but this is exactly for me the difficult situation, because we want them to stay. We are ready to open discussion with them. But in the end, if we give them this and they go out, we will have nothing to negotiate because we've been ready to give them so much. And also, is it going to help David Cameron to get a good result? What is the best strategy? I think here we really have to put our brain together for UK and for us to make sure we don't do a big mistake, huh?
Now, the president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, reacted shortly after David Cameron's speech on Friday. He said he counts on Cameron to make the case for Britain to remain in the European Union. You know the mood in Britain. You know how aggressive the tabloids can be vis-à-vis Europe. Can David Cameron win this argument? Can he convince the British voters to stay in Europe?
Well, the first point of your question is really important to remember, that David Cameron, in principle, on paper, is actually for the UK staying in Europe. You sometimes forget that because his party is so Eurosceptical. But he actually is in favour of doing that. He hasn't campaigned for a minute for that cause. So we don't know how strong he's going to be, how strong he's prepared to be politically, he can afford to be in terms of that kind of campaigning. I think, we've also seen what happens with polling. Polling data has already proved to be completely useless in this election result. So if you look at the polls now, it suggests that actually the British do want to stay, which is quite encouraging. But 2 years away from a referendum, we can't possibly be complacent about that kind of result.
Are you worried? Is it going to have
I think there's a very real risk that Britain might vote to leave. I don't personally want it, and my paper doesn't want it either. And I think most of the business community wants Britain to stay. The Americans want Britain to stay. I think France and Germany ultimately want Britain to stay as well. But no one is prepared to make concessions at any price. And the difficulty with the timing, don't forget, is that in 2017, which is when it's the most likely date for this referendum, is an election year in France. Presidential and legislative. So it's absolutely the worst possible moment to expect anybody in France to be making concessions to UK.
Now, interestingly, UKIP got 13% of the popular vote. UKIP is, of course, the UK Independence Party, anti-Europe, anti-immigration, but they only got one seat. That's because of the first-past-the-post system. And Nigel Farage, your colleague in Brussels, is also a member of the European Parliament, lost his seat. Are you surprised?
Well, I think when I was at school, I was learning about the paradox of the UK system, and I think it's still there. You've been mentioning it in the beginning of this broadcast, and I think this is something where obviously Cameron is not going to get ready for opening the.
Does Nigel Farage's defeat and the fact that he stepped down, albeit maybe not for long, does it make David Cameron's job easier?
I'm not so sure, because he will also have to face the Eurosceptic or even sometimes the Euro hostile in his own party. What I can see also in the European Parliament, where the UKIP is quite strong, is that there are a bridge between UKIP and the Conservatives. So there are some bridge in the mindsets that Cameron will have to face, huh?
And I think the other point is that they can dictate the debate and influence the debate way beyond their presence and their electoral presence in the National Assembly, in the British Parliament. You've seen this with the National Front in France. It's exactly the same. With 2 MPs, they manage yet nonetheless to dictate often the terms of the debate in internal French politics. And so their influence, because of polling data, because of their performance at last year's European election, because of the Eurosceptic British press, there's all sorts of other channels for them to influence British politics, which aren't necessarily dependent on the number of seats they have at Westminster.
Absolutely. And as I said, they're actually, in terms of popular vote, the third largest party in Britain at the moment. Very briefly, a word on Scotland. We're going to talk a lot about Scotland in the second part of the show, but the SNP won a landslide victory in Scotland, taking 56 out of 59 seats. This is something that a lot of people had predicted, but nevertheless, it radically changes the political landscape north of the border.
Yeah, well, looking at the situation of Scotland from Paris, I think it's quite a paradox, because the referendum on independence was lost not so long ago, and now you have this result. Obviously, here it's also a breaking news, also because their leader has been appearing on the public scene.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah,
very charismatic.
everybody has noticed that now she exists and that she's a real leader in this region. I think for David Cameron, it is really a challenge, because he has to fight on both sides. We just discussed the Brexit, the situation of Scotland, and he already said that he's going to have the biggest devolution law that exists in the world. Well, that's also something you have to handle in the end.
Do you agree this is a major challenge for David Cameron, who understands the mood in Scotland? He says he wants the best deal for Scotland, offering the most devolved sort of powers in the world for Scotland. This is going very far. This United Kingdom doesn't look very united again.
I think David Cameron thought that by holding the referendum and winning it, last year, that the question would be finalised. And what he found is that the question hasn't gone away. In fact, Nicola Sturgeon has just risen like a sort of the star of this election on the back of a very strong it's a sort of nationalist feeling. It's not quite independence because they didn't vote the Scottish for independence, but it's nonetheless a very strong nationalist feeling in Scotland. And she has been the absolute star of this campaign in the debate where people outside Scotland discovered her for the first time. Nobody had heard of her in England or Wales or outside Scotland. And there she was debating with Clegg and with Miliband and with Cameron. And she really, with her charisma and a great sort of sense of humour, she managed to capture the imagination of a lot of people outside Scotland. So I think that she will be in an incredibly strong position to try and extract whatever she can in terms of devolved powers. Don't forget that Cameron is also, though, wants to balance devolved powers to Scotland with devolved powers to England. And that's another complicated issue that hasn't even begun to be tackled. So, we have this sort of identity politics on such a number of levels between, English, Scotland, and then the UK and Europe, that it's the beginning of a new chapter. It's not the end.
A very challenging chapter indeed. Thank you very much, Sophie Peder and Pervenche Berès, for taking part in this edition of Talking Europe. Now, please stay with me. I'll return just after the news break in about 10 minutes on France 24.